All right, everyone, thanks for coming tonight. We're really excited to be offering this series of photography workshops with the Rocky Mountain School of Photography. So I'm glad you're all here this evening, and I hope you can make it to the others that we have coming up in the coming months. We'll just get right into it. I'm really happy to introduce Neil Chaput from Rocky Mountain School of Photography.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody. Since we hadn't done this before, we didn't know how many people we have, and this is great. So you all got one of those handouts, I think, and that handout explains exposure actually quite well. This topic in school would probably take me usually 2 to 3 hours, so I'm going to be going kind of quick, and I'm going to say that looking up things in there will also be good for you. Again, my name is Neil, and I started teaching photography 46 years ago, which makes me older than most of you put together. I had the fun of studying under Ansel Adams. Some of you may have heard of him. That was in 1973 and so forth. Oh, and one thing Ansel said, which I think is very interesting, is someone asked what the best brand of camera is. And he said there's no best brand of camera, it's the photographer. And that is true. So if you ever get in arguments with your friends and they say, oh, you need to get this or this or this, you don't need to, okay? Because what you got is probably perfect and so forth. So anyway, I'm going to go over exposure, and I was told I can go past 7:30. So if you want to stay, I'll probably be showing a few pictures after, photographs after 7:30 for some of the examples of what I've done and so forth. So, and you're welcome to ask questions, but not about your particular camera. Okay, and I will probably stay here until Sarah kicks me out, okay, when the library closes. And if you want to ask me a question, then you can, and so forth. So everybody, I look at photography this way. Our left brain side is what learns the f-stops and the shutter speeds and all that kind of stuff. Our right brain is the creative part and good composition and all that. And that's really, of course, something you just keep getting better and better at all the time. But if you don't understand exposure, it's really, understanding exposure makes things so much simpler. So I've got a slideshow here, and I got a few examples after the slideshow to show you. And I assume all of you have cameras where the lenses come off. Okay, because this is not a cell phone. You're welcome to be in here if you only got a cell phone. But this is not a cell phone lecture, okay? And so let's get going. Okay, I'm going to start with ISO. And ISO stands for, you don't need to know this, it stands for International Standards Organization. Because it used to be 25, 30 years ago that lots of countries had their own way of exposing for cameras. And it was, so if you went to France, something would be completely different, and you'd have to almost like start over again. So the International Standards Organization decided to make everything the same. So ISO is how sensitive your sensor is to light. Before it was how sensitive it is to film. And by the way, in photography, we've got a word called stop, S-T-O-P. And what a stop always means is double or half the amount of light. So if your camera set on ISO 100 and then you go to 200, that means you can shoot where it's twice as dark as you can when it's ISO 100. So ISO is something that most of your cameras set, well, they all set it themselves, but but then you can change it if you're in a dark situation. We used to use thirds of stops a lot, like between 100 and 200, we had 125 and 160. If you got a way of turning that off on your camera and going to full stops and not third stops, that's kind of a good thing to do because you're not using film. In film days, we had film that was 160 ISO and lots of those other numbers. Today, we don't. Today, with digital, and I assume everybody here is shooting digital. Anybody here shooting film? Good, you're in the right class, okay. Okay, so let's look at it this way. You always get higher quality when your ISO is lower. Now, Lots of your cameras have auto ISO on them, which means the camera figures out the ISO and says, well, you need a higher ISO or a lower ISO. And that's what lots of cameras do. And when you're starting out, the auto ISO is a wonderful thing to have. But as you start learning more, you're going to say sometimes, I want to set the ISO on what I want. Most of your cameras have a base ISO of 100. A few of them have a base ISO of 200. Okay? That's going to give you less noise, and it's going to give you your highest quality. So like right now, if you were out shooting in downtown Missoula, it's a bright sunny day, and since we're in daylight savings time, it's really bright, and you could be on ISO 100 the whole time, unless you're in a dark alley or something like that, and you're going to get the best quality you can get. I'm going to show you through a few photos near the end of my talk that I shoot the Nutcracker every year. Have any of you ever gone to the local Nutcracker? Okay, I shoot it every year. I'm going to show you a few shots from there. My ISO there is 3200. And that's because I'm shooting on a stage where it's dark, and so my ISO has to go higher so I can shoot in lower light. Is that kind of making sense? Okay? And once in a great while, and probably most of us have done this if we said it ourselves, I've been shooting the ballet at 3200, and I go on a bright sunny day, and I start shooting at 3200, in my camera, oh, they really look good. Then I go to my computer, and you look at them big and say, oh, those landscapes are kind of noisy. They don't look quite as good. So you can, like I said, be on auto ISO, but it's best to set the ISO yourself. When I show pictures, I'm going to talk about that. Does that make sense, everybody? So having your ISO as low as you can go is what's going to give you the highest quality you can get. But if I was shooting ISO 100 at the ballet, my shutter speed would probably be 1 second, and there's no way I could stop a dancer. Make sense? So that's any questions on ISO real quick? And some of your cameras now go up to ISO 100,000 or something like that. Okay? Most of your cameras don't, and you probably wouldn't ever have a reason to be on ISO 100,000. But, so anyway, those are stops. And on your cameras in your menu, probably have a way to turn off the third stops, which I don't think you're ever going to need, because going from 500 to 640 with digital, you're not going to see any difference. So those are your ISOs. And okay, let's go on. I'm just showing you exposure here, and the room isn't pitch dark, but this is remember, a stop is double or half the amount of light. Okay, this is the piano keys in our piano at home. 3 stops underexposed, 2 stops underexposed, 1 stop underexposed. This is correct exposure. This is 1 stop overexposed. So overexposed means I'm letting in too much light. 2 stops overexposed, 3 stops overexposed. Just want to show you what a stop looks like, okay? And all your digital cameras will be pretty much like this. Okay, when we're controlling light, going out to shoot a photograph, we usually have 2 ways to control light. All cameras have this. We have the f-stop, which is the size of the hole, which we'll get to in a minute, and the shutter speed. The shutter speed controls light by the amount of time the shutter goes across the back of your camera. So 1 second sounds like 1 second. And well, let's stay up here. So everybody, these are full seconds down here. Most of you have 30 seconds, 15 seconds, 8, 4, 2, 1. And then you've got, and by the way, these are full stops. These aren't thirds of stops. And then most of your cameras go up to 1/4000, 1/8000. If you've got a mirrorless camera, you probably have a shutter speed of 1/32,000th of a second, which you will probably never need. You can certainly stop the wings of a hummingbird at something like that. I'm going to show a few pictures of this. You know, when you go to, you're walking up Kootenai Creek, and you want a picture of the water, and you want that slow shutter speed, like 1 second, 1/2 second, 1/4 of a second, and it has that beautiful flowing water look, okay? Those are your slower shutter speeds, probably starting from a 15th of a second or 30th down. But the lower you go, the more that water blurs and looks really beautiful. probably you need a tripod for most of your very slow shutter speeds. Okay, if you're trying to, I used to shoot all the races for Run Wild Missoula a few years ago, and I'd probably be at a 500th of a second or something like that to stop a runner coming at the finish line and get a sharp shot there. If you're shooting the wings of a bird or a hummingbird, you might be up in this range up here. Okay, so shutter speeds control light by the amount of time your shutter remains open. Okay, and these are f-stops. Okay, f-stop is how big the opening, how large the opening in your lens is. And you everybody, this is an alphabet. This is like learning the alphabet in photography. It's good to know the f-stops. F1 is a very, and by the way, this is all in that handout you got also, just so you know this. I still think it's good to take notes, but this is in your handout. F1 is a very, very large opening. And all of your lenses start someplace, like F2 or F2.8, and they end up down here with a small opening. So the f-stop controls light by how big the opening in your lens is. So I never got to do this, and I wish I had. About 10 years, 12 years ago, we got a call at school from the FBI, and they wanted to know, they wanted me to fly up to Chicago to teach their agents how to shoot photographs from inside a black van with very clear windows at night. And I think that would have been so much fun doing that. And they were trying, and then their budget ran out all of a sudden in the Chicago branch, and they called me back and said, no, you can't come up. And I was so excited. I thought that'd be kind of cool, actually. And, but what they wanted to do was catch people on the street dealing drugs and things like that. So they wanted to know how to do that. Well, if you've got an opening in your lens that's big, like f1 or 1.4 or 2, it's letting in so much light, and like as I'm going to show you examples of pictures in a few minutes, it's letting in so much light that what happens is you can shoot in extreme low light. So everybody think about this. I've got two ways to control light, the f-stop and the shutter speed. If the aperture is bigger, it's letting in more light. Make sense, everybody? And so if it's dark out, and then I raise my ISO up also, I can shoot in almost pitch dark and still get a photograph. Okay, so the aperture also does something else we'll get to in just a minute, very important. But the aperture controls how much light there is. Every one of these, like f4 is half as much light as 2.8. f5.6 is half as much light as f4. So every time it's called stopping down, every time that little opening in your lens gets smaller, then what's happening, it's letting in half as much light as the one before it. So far, making sense? So every aperture controls light by how large or small the opening is. And we're going to talk about depth of field in a minute. But let's say you're out at 10 o'clock tonight in Missoula, and you don't have a tripod, and you want to do night shots of neon lights and all kinds of stuff like that, kind of a cool thing doing all that. Well, you would probably want a lens that had a larger aperture, because if the aperture is larger, then your shutter speed could be fast enough where you can hold the camera, which we're going to get to in just a minute. So these are your f-stops. Like if you were a wildlife photographer and you had a lens this long, okay, think about this, everybody. You're a wildlife photographer, and you're shooting whatever wildlife you want to take photographs of. And when are most wildlife out, usually? Mammals. Dawn and dusk. Thank you. That's the correct answer. So at dawn and dusk, it's dark. There's no whiteboard in here, so I can't quite do this, but I'm just going to give you an example from film days, okay? This is, okay, a 300 millimeter lens And this is kind of off the topic of exposure, but we're going to get right back to exposure because I think this will make sense to you. Normally, we think of a 50 millimeter lens as being normal. So a 300 millimeter lens, divide 50 into 300, goes 6 times. So far, so good? So putting a 300 millimeter lens in your camera looks like you're looking through 6 power binoculars. So it's going to make the animals you're taking photographs of a lot closer. Okay, I think this example will help you understand this, I think, pretty well. So let's go back 15 years before digital. Okay, before digital, we had the film that all nature photographers practically use was a film made by Fuji called Velvia. Its ISO is 50. Well, that chart in ISO that I showed you didn't even go down to 50. It started at 100. 50 is such a low number that you need a whole lot of light. So far, so good? Okay, it's a low number, you need lots of light. Okay, if you were competing wildlife photographer professional, because everybody else used Fuji Velvia 50, you had to too, because the lower your number was with film, the higher your quality was going to be. So you needed that quality because you were competing with other people. Well, the 2 main brands back then were Canon and Nikon, and they hate each other. And they've been fighting with each other for 40 years, and they're both as good as each other. But if you read one of their brochures, they'll say they're better, but they're not. Okay, because all the brands are equal. Okay, and they made 2 300 each. Both those brands, they copied each other. They made 2 300 millimeter lenses. They both made one that was f2.8, and they both made one that was f4. This one cost about $5,000, and this one cost $1,000. Which one was sharper? Which one was better? They're equal. But what was the difference? This one right here was 1 stop faster than this one was. Well, everybody, if your ISO is 50, and it's dusk and dawn, which means it's pretty darn close to being dark, right? And your ISO is so low already, and you were a wildlife photographer and you were competing, you had to spend the $5,000 to get that one, because 1 stop faster lets you shoot where it's twice as dark, because 1 stop is double or half, in the same amount of light. Well, then digital comes along. And digital comes along, and especially newer digital cameras. And newer digital cameras, when you're at ISO 800 and 1600, you're still getting really good quality. Which means nowadays, you wouldn't need the f2.8 lens, you could buy the f4 lens. Is that making sense? Because, so when you've got that, so that's a good example of why f-stops are so important. So every one of you, and when you go home, look on the front of your lens. I don't have a whiteboard I can draw on, so but here's a Canon lens right here, and it says 50 millimeter. That's the length of my lens. That means that's a normal, what we call a normal lens. And by the way, normal means that I see you 2 at this table and you 2 at that table, and you look like you're 7 feet apart. A normal lens makes you look 7 feet apart, okay? A telephoto lens, the pitcher and the catcher in the baseball game look like they're 10 feet apart, but they're actually however far apart they are. That's a long lens. It squishes things together. A wide-angle lens, any of you ever been on a cruise ship? If you have, you see the brochure of how big the room you're going to be staying in is. And then you get there and think, oh, this isn't quite that size. Well, a wide-angle lens spreads things out and makes things look wide. A long lens squishes things together. So this says 50 on it, which means it's a normal lens. It sees like my eye sees. I look through here, and you 2 women look the same distance apart to my camera as you do to my eye, okay? But the other thing it says on here, it says 1:1.4. Okay, it says 1:1.4. The 1 is a ratio. We don't care about that. This lens, on your lens, it always tells you what f-stop is your widest aperture. Okay, that means this lens starts at 1.4. And then all lenses end up usually 16, 22, or 32, someplace in this range down here. You don't pay for this on a lens, okay? You pay for how wide your aperture is. Because to have a wider aperture means that it costs a lot more to make your lens because a wider aperture lets you shoot where it's darker. So if you're a landscape photographer, that's all you do. You never shoot landscape, well, there's always exceptions. You might be doing something really artsy. But you never shoot landscapes at 1.4 or 2. Usually shoot landscape at, 16 or 11 or 8 or something like that. So a landscape photographer would never need a lens that's more expensive because they don't need to shoot in the low light. But what if you're a wildlife photographer? What if you like shooting at night? What if you want to shoot even events, but you don't want to use flash? Because the problem with flash is it usually looks like you used what? Flash, okay? Flash usually looks like you did what you did, okay, unless you get professional, and then you learn how to make flash where it doesn't look like you used flash. So anyway, those are your apertures. Now, when you click them on your camera, they're going to go a third in between here and a third in here. And do not turn off your thirds of stops on your aperture or your shutter speed. Use your thirds of stop. On your ISO, you can go to full stops. Can I keep going? We doing okay? Okay. Okay. So this is just one example. Let's say I'm out shooting and I turn on my meter. I look at my camera and it says I'm at 1/60th f/16. Because every time I shoot, I need an f-stop and a shutter speed. I always need those two things. Anyone here ever make a pinhole camera when they were high school or something like that? None of you did? Okay. A pinhole camera is where you take a pin and stick it through a little piece of aluminum foil and you tape that in the front of your oatmeal box, and then you put a piece of film in the back and you go out shooting, and your f-stop is usually f256 and your exposure's 2 minutes long and so forth. But we won't go there. So everybody, let's say we're at 60th at f/16. Okay, that's your, and then you think to yourself, okay, but I'm doing a portrait. In a portrait, I probably don't want f/16 because at f/16, the person will be real sharp, but the trees in the background will be just as sharp. I'm going to have so much depth of field. I'm going to get to this I'm going to show you slides in a minute. I'm going to have so much depth of field here that everything in my shot's going to be sharp. I'm doing a portrait. I want to do what? I'm going to show you depth of field slides in a couple minutes. I want less depth of field, a wider aperture, and by the way, this is wider because f2 is big, and f22 and 16 is tiny. This is a wider aperture. So everybody, if I wanted to, and by the way, this is called, letting in more light is called opening up, and this is good for your notes. It's also in that handout you got. Opening up means letting in more light. Stopping down or closing down, there's two words for this. Stopping down or closing down means letting in less light. So opening up means letting in more light, and stopping down or closing down means letting in less light. If I change one f-stop and one shutter speed in the opposite direction, I still have the exact same amount of light. So if I'm out there shooting now, the light's not changing until it gets close to sunset, and I'm at a 60th at f/16, and I decide I want more depth of field, and like I said, those slides are coming up as soon as this slide is over. If I want more depth of field, less depth of field, 16 makes everything sharp. f11 makes less sharp. f8 makes less sharp. 5, 6, 4, so forth. So I start opening up my aperture from 16 to 11 to 8 to f5.6, 4, 2.8. Let's say your lens goes to f2. Most of your lenses probably don't, but let's say yours does. I'm opening up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stops. We agree, everybody? If every stop is twice as much light, I'm letting in 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64 times more light. So in opening up 6 stops, I'm letting in 64 times more light, which would do what to my exposure? My exposure would be pure white. I'm overexposing so much it would be pure white. But if I'm opening up 6 f-stops, But I stop down 6 shutter speeds, I'm going to have the exact same amount of light. So now I take my shutter speed, and by the way, your camera tells you this. And so every time I open up one f-stop, so here I get 1/2 as much light, 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, 1/32, 64 times more light by going to here, 64 times less light going to here, and 64 times more light going to there. And this, every one of those, my exposure would look identical. Does that make sense? So your 2 ways of, you set your ISO first. My 2 ways of controlling light are by opening or closing the aperture and the shutter speed. So let's talk about depth of field, because depth of field is kind of, this is what makes you creative. This is what makes you really creative. Oh, okay, here is front of a lens close up, just so you can see. And this tells me this is a 50 millimeter lens. Okay, if you had a zoom lens, it would say, 24 to 70. And this is my f-stop, 1:1.4. They don't tell you what your smallest aperture is because you don't pay for that. It takes a lot more glass and a lot more expensive glass to make a lens that's fast. Okay? So on all of your lenses, you're going to see something like that. If you have a zoom lens, it's probably going to say 3.5 to 5.6 or something like that. So your f-stop actually varies depending on how long your focal length is. But that's what you're going to see in the front of a lens. Okay, so look when you get home, or when the lights go on in here. Okay, so let's look at depth of field. Depth of field is probably one of the things that makes you the most creative that you can be when you're photographing. This is what you do to make your shot more exciting and more interesting. Why are cell phone photos? Well, I got my cell phone, it's up there. And I shoot photos with my cell phone, and they look pretty good. Okay, and yeah, cell phones are pretty good. But your cell phone sensor is like itty bitty bitty. And an itty bitty sensor means that you have tons of depth of field. So if I was taking a photograph of you sitting right there, and I only wanted you sharp, and those of you in the background sharp, with my cell phone, I couldn't do it. You'd be just as sharp back there almost as the person up front. Is that making sense? Okay? With a bigger sensor, that's not true, and I'm not going to go into that right now. But depth of field is the part of your photograph that is sharp. Okay? Depth of field is the area of your photograph that is perfectly sharp. And I'm exaggerating a tiny bit on some of these things, but an hour-long lecture, it's good to do that. So depth of field is the area in your photograph that is sharp. Generally speaking, in portrait photography, you almost always want what's called a shallow depth of field. So if I want you sharp and everyone behind you out of focus, I want to shoot at f2 or 2.8 or 4. So far, so good? When I want a shallow depth of field, I want the biggest aperture I can get. So everybody think about this. You're a portrait photographer and you're making a living in portrait photography. And good length portrait lens is like a 100 millimeter lens, because that makes the face look the most pleasing it can look. If I got a wide angle lens on, that means I'm real close to you, your nose looks bigger and things like that. So I want, let's say I've got a 100 millimeter lens and you're a professional portrait photographer. And I've got a 100 millimeter lens that starts at f2, or I've got one that starts at f4. Okay, and I'm making my living doing this. Which one do I want? f2 has a bigger aperture. f4 has a smaller aperture. If it starts at f4, it can't go to f2 because it's not adjustable. It just is at f4. So if I want to really blur the background, I want what's called a faster lens. The aperture is bigger. So if you're doing lots of portraits, you'd like to be at f2 or maybe f2.8 because that larger aperture blurs the background way out of focus. So far, so good? What if you're a landscape photographer? Normally, and you're shooting a waterfall, and you've got some rocks You're at Glacier National Park and you're shooting on Trail of the Cedars, where everyone shoots that same waterfall. Most of you have probably tried shooting that waterfall when you cross off that little bridge at Trail of the Cedars. Okay. Well, you probably want from maybe 6 foot or 8 foot sharp to as far back as you can see. You want a lot of depth of field in that waterfall. So you probably need to be at 11 or 16. Does that make sense? You need that little tiny aperture, okay? Because that way the foreground becomes sharp and so does the background. So let's think of the types of photography where we want more depth of field or less depth of field. In portraiture, we want a shallow depth of field usually. In weddings, which would be kind of related to portraiture, you want a shallow depth of field because you want the background out of focus. How about architecture? Well, if you're traveling a lot and you're in some foreign country and you're doing lots of architecture, you probably want the foreground sharp and the background sharp. So probably you'd be at 11 or 16 or something like that. With your cell phone, it doesn't matter, okay? And how about wildlife photography? What do you want sharp? Probably nothing but what? The face of the animal, right? So you'd probably have a large aperture, and large is a small number, unfortunately it's backwards. You want a large aperture like 4 or 2.8 or 2. So it depends on what kind of photography you're doing. I love documentary photography. I did a book on one-room schools with a professor from the university 7 years ago. We traveled photographing lots of the active public one-room schools in the state. And I shot almost everything. Oh, I got a couple of those photographs in here, I think. Wide open. Why'd I shoot? Wide open means what? Large aperture. Wide open means large aperture because I wanted that shallow depth of field. I didn't want much else in my photograph to be sharp. Yes, 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 yes? Okay, so let's look at some examples. Look at these piano keys. These are shot with this lens right here at f2. Now watch the keys get sharper as we stop down. Notice how out of focus the keys in the back and the keys in the front are. 2.8. By the way, is the exposure changing, yes or no? It's not, is it? Which means I'm going back to f2. I'm showing you depth of field. I'm shooting on a tripod here. I'm showing you depth of field. I am changing the aperture. But because the exposure is not changing, I have to be changing what also? The shutter speed. So I'm changing both. So every time the aperture gets 1 stop smaller, the shutter speed is getting what? 1 stop slower, right? Because it's got to go the opposite way, okay? So here's 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, I think that's the last, and 22. Notice the 22. The keys are sharp from the front to the back. My focus point is still that 5th black key. That's still where I'm focused, or the 4th black key. That's where I'm focused. But every time I'm changing my aperture, I'm also changing my shutter speed. I'm going to show you different ways we do that. So let's go all the way. Now I'm going to show you the pictures of the flowers in your little brochure there. And these were I shot these in Bouchard Gardens years ago. I think actually on Velvia film. Okay, well here's F32, even sharper. Okay, so let's look at this little flower. Okay, this is Bouchard Gardens in Victoria. I think it's Victoria. It's in British Columbia. And I'm focused on this flower here. So the flower's way in the front, and look how out of focus the flowers in the back are. They're very much out of focus. So now I'm going to use correct terminology. I'm going to do what? Stop down or close down my what? It's called the aperture, or you could say the f-stop, either one. I'm going to stop down or close down the aperture. As I stop down and close down the aperture, what's going to happen? The flowers in the front and the flowers in the back are going to get sharp. The exposure is not changing, which means, what else am I changing besides the f-stop? The shutter speed. And I'm only changing the shutter speed, why? I'm not trying to stop action. I'm to control the light. So I'm only changing the shutter speed to control the light. So let's go to 2.8. 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, 22. I think that's that's the last one. So there's 22. Notice the grass in the way back in the back is much sharper. And look, and some of you might like F22 better, and some of you might like, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. Neil, stop that. Okay, let me get back to play. Okay, let's go back now. So there's wide open at F2. Again, that's called wide open. So you can see in macro close-up photography, sometimes you want the flowers to be sharper, sometimes you don't want them to be. Sometimes you want more of it to be sharp, sometimes you want less of it to be sharp. Ask a few questions. Anyone got questions on this? Anybody? Yes. She wants you to have the microphone.
Dumb question. So when on a digital camera, then does that make that adjustment automatically on shutter speed?
That's what we're going to talk about in just a minute. Okay, so I will answer that question. Depends on what setting you're on. Okay, and that's a big thing on exposure I want to talk about tonight. So I will get to your question. Good question. That's my next topic. You're reading my mind. Yes.
If you're not worried about depth of field, is there an advantage if you're in a decent light? I guess.
Well, faster shutter speed is going to probably always make your shot a little bit sharper. But if you're holding your camera correctly, you're not going to see a difference between 125th of a second and 250th of a second if there's nothing moving in your shot. Because at that fast a shutter speed, if you're holding your camera steady, you won't see a difference. But I think probably almost always we are really looking to see depth of field is really kind of important because it makes your shot look really, really good. So everybody, I used to live, my parents were alive, they lived in Vermont, and I teach week-long workshops up in Vermont. And we go with 16 photographers and we shoot all these wonderful places beginning of October when fall colors are out. So far, so good, okay? So lots of these landscape things I'm shooting at probably F8, F11, F16 to give me more depth of field to make more of my photographs sharp. Make sense? But then I go up to an overlook. And the closest thing from the overlook, there's a little white, because Vermont churches are always white, there's a little white church down there and you've got all the beautiful fall colors and so forth. I'm on an overlook and the closest thing to me is a quarter mile away. Well, if the closest thing is a quarter mile away, how much depth of field do I need? A quarter mile on your camera is infinity. Make sense, everybody? Well, if everything's at infinity, I could shoot at f2, which gives me almost no depth of field. But if everything's at infinity, I don't worry about depth of field. So see, in a case like that, I would not worry about depth of field. Does that make sense? This is off the subject. No, it's not. It's photography. Your sharpest aperture, okay, on your lenses. Okay, lots of us think, well, I need to stop down a lot because I want a lot of depth of field. Your sharpest aperture on your lenses are usually about 2 stops from being wide open. So think about this, everybody. Your sharpest aperture is usually about 2 stops. It could be 1, it could be 3, but it's about 2 stops from being wide open. Which means if my lens starts at f2.8, well, let's go down 2 stops from 2.8, and you probably don't remember this unless you knew this before. 2 stops from 2.8 would be 4, 5.6. Everybody with me? Okay, I was at 2.8, and next comes 4, next comes 5.6. Don't count your thirds of stops. Which means 5.6 is probably going to give you, if you were making a big print, it would probably make more of your photo, it would make your photograph really sharp if you're having a big print. So far, so good. Does that make sense, everybody? So, if I'm standing on that hilltop, I guess they don't have mountains. Well, they think they do. But you're standing on a hilltop in Vermont. Anyone from Vermont here? No Vermonters, okay. You're standing, so I can say whatever I want. You're standing on the hilltop in Vermont, and everything's a quarter mile away, okay? I mean, it's all at infinity. In that case, everybody, what f-stop would I want to use, probably? 5.6. It'd be sharper. Does that make sense? Okay? So that's just a little tidbit to know. But depth of field is more important than that, because the amount of quality you lose is just a tiny bit. So if I'm shooting that waterfall 200 feet away, and there's rocks in front that are 6 feet away, okay, I probably need a smaller aperture, like 11, or maybe even 16, okay? Well, that might not be quite as sharp, but if I shoot at 5.6, then either the waterfall is going to be out of focus, or the foreground's going to be out of focus. In that case, depth of field is more important than using your sharpest aperture. I just thought I'd throw in the sharpest aperture, because lots of you have kit lenses, and your kit lenses are really good lenses, but they're usually like, you know, they're plastic, they're really good quality, and the optics are pretty good. But if you've got a professional lens, then you're going to be getting higher quality. So if you've got anyway, your sharpest aperture is about 2 stops from being wide open. Okay, now let's get to the part that's a little harder, but kind of fun. Oh, let's say this first. By the way, everybody, this lecture would normally I'd be giving in my summer intensive classes or my professional intensive classes, and actually I wouldn't, the guy in the back there who teaches for us would be. Hi, Rob. But what was I going to say? What was my topic? Oh, start me again, somebody. What was I saying? No, not that. No. So everybody, when I'm shooting, when I'm photographing and opening up and stopping down my aperture and so forth and my shutter speed, I'm trying to get my exposure. What I was going to say is this. All of your lenses think everything is middle gray. This carpet is what your lens thinks everything is. Look down this carpet. This is a gray card. This carpet's about 18% reflectance. That means you got 100% light hitting it and 18% comes back. You don't need to know this number, but you read almost any book on photography, and you're going to see that 18%. 18% reflectance is exactly halfway between black and white. So far, so good? Okay, and 18% reflectance is halfway between black and white. That means when you look through your camera, and your light meter is what you're using, your light meter thinks everything is halfway between black and white. Who's ever shot a photograph of a white cat in the snow? Or a white dog in the snow? How did it look? Not real cool. Because your camera's trying to make it 18% reflectance. And the camera's going to say, the camera doesn't know it's white cat or white dog in the snow. The camera says, I've got to make this 18%, and your camera underexposes 2 stops, and everything looks really, really bad. And not only does it look 2 stops underexposed, but all of a sudden it's real purplish or blue or something like that. Does that make sense to some of you? You ever get blue and purple snow? It's because you're underexposing, okay? That's called very much underexposed. The example of the opposite would be you're at a concert and you're taking a photograph of someone at the concert without flash, so you're not being kicked out or anything. Well, some concerts they wouldn't care. And it's all black stage, okay? So everything is black except a person on a stool playing guitar or something like that. So 90% of your photograph is black. The camera sees all that black and it says, oh, I've got to make this 18% gray. I got to make all this black a lot lighter. And the person on playing the guitar is all washed out, and they're pure white. Does that make sense? If right now I pulled up those shades right there, and I stood in front of that window, and you took my photograph, okay, and let's say it's fairly dark in here, I just open up one shade. Your camera sees all that light back there and says, I've got to make this 18%. I come out a silhouette. Is that making sense, everybody? You've all seen these, haven't you? So let's try to make a little bit of headway on this. There's going to be some stuff you got to look up, I promise you. I can't give you all this. So let's go to, by the way, they're talking about mushrooms next door. Just in case you're curious what's going on over there. Sounds like they're done. Okay, everybody, so here's exposure modes. First of all, I would love it if you could get advanced enough where you stop using the little runner, the mountain, the flower on your dial, okay? Because that gets you somewhere, but knowing more than that is a whole lot nicer. These are, and I only got Canon and Nikon because the slide's a couple years old. Now I'd have Sony and Fuji and Panasonic, Olympus, all on there. But it's all pretty much the same thing. So everybody, what we've got is, let's go over these four: manual, shutter preferred, aperture preferred, program. And then I'm going to tell you what I recommend you using in a short lecture like this. If this was a 4-hour lecture, I would be saying more than this. So every time you take a photograph, you got to set what? Or someone's got to set the shutter speed and the aperture. So far, so good. You set your ISO first. Okay, when I show you some slide examples in a minute, I'm going to go a few different things here. So manual is what all cameras were for 125 years. They were all manual. Manual means that you set the shutter speed and you set the aperture. So when you see M on that little dial on top of your camera, it's probably where most of you see it. When you go to manual, you're setting aperture and you're setting the shutter speed. And the meter is telling you if you're right or not. The thing is, if you're shooting a white cat in the snow, you don't want to be right. You don't want to do what the camera says. You want to fix it yourself. But when you're on manual, you set both things yourself and the camera doesn't control it at all. If you don't like what the camera is saying, you can change it because you don't need that. Okay, so now, what happened in 1980, I can't remember, I usually remember, 80, what happened in the early 80s, I believe, is automatic came out. And automatic meant this. These two right here are automatic, okay? Automatic, this is manual, this is automatic. We'll get to program in a minute. This is automatic. Automatic meant this. And when this came out, so many professionals said, I'm never going to use automatic and so forth. Of course, everyone changes their minds. I'm never going to. There are professional photographers out there, everybody, with freezers full of film that they'll never use. Because I swore they'd never go to digital, okay? I was one of them, but I didn't get the freezer full of film. And I did get digital pretty quick. Since I had to since I taught. Automatic means you set one thing and the camera sets the other. Make sense so far? So if you were doing a lot of portrait photography, what's probably real important what's probably real important in portrait photography? The aperture, because you want to control what? Depth of field. So if you go to aperture preferred, what happens is you set the aperture, and what's the camera going to do? It's going to find you the shutter speed. It's going to set the shutter speed for you that makes it 18% reflectance. Make sense? You set the aperture, the camera sets the shutter speed that gives you 18%. Okay? If you were doing running water at a slow shutter speed at some waterfall or something, then you go to shutter preferred and you'd set the shutter speed and the camera would pick the aperture that makes it 18%. So automatic means you set one and the camera sets the other. You don't need to know this, but I think it's kind of funny. The 5 big brands 30 years ago were Nikon, Canon, Minolta, which became Sony, Pentax, and Olympus. And 4 of them decided that aperture preferred was more important because setting your depth of field was more important. Canon decided that shutter preferred was more important because they wanted to become the sports camera for sports photographers. So 4 brands chose aperture preferred, 1 brand chose shutter preferred. Finally, after about 5 years, one of the brands said, oh, we could put both of those in the same camera. It took a long time. Now all your cameras have both of those. So that means automatic. Automatic means you set one, you set the aperture, the camera sets the shutter speed. Or shutter preferred means you set the shutter speed, the camera sets the aperture. Program means the camera sets both. And the only time I would ever use program would be maybe I'm out hiking with my wife and I want someone to take our picture and they don't look like they know photography. So I put it on P real quick and hand them the camera and then I don't worry because the exposure is going to come out. Okay, that makes sense, everybody? So aperture preferred. Now, let's think about this for a minute, okay? I used to use manual a whole lot, and I loved manual. In our school, we mainly teach people, we always teach people to use manual first, because it's like if you're driving stick shift in a car, if you're learning and you learn a stick shift, it's probably easier than going back to stick shift. Isn't that true? So, when we usually start students on manual. But I'm going to change this and say, and you don't need to do this, but what I like shooting, usually now, with our newer cameras, is aperture preferred, okay? Now let's think about aperture preferred for a minute. Then I'm going to add something that I don't have slides for you. You're going to need to look up to see how to do it in your camera, but I think it's going to make sense to you. Do any of you know if you've got, how many of you know you have a mirrorless camera? Let's see your hands. Okay. How many of you know you have a single lens reflex camera? Okay. Some of you don't know what you got. Okay. Yours is mirrorless. Okay. Just because I see it sitting there, I can tell you. Okay. So everybody, I like to shoot on aperture preferred, which means I'm picking the aperture. What's the camera picking? The shutter speed. So far, so good. Okay, so I'm picking the aperture, the camera's picking the shutter speed. Oh, wait a minute. What would we use shutter speed, what would we use shutter priority for? Sports, right? Well, would I rather be an aperture preferred or shutter preferred for sports? Okay, think about it. In sports, you almost always want just the one person, the runner coming in to the finish line. You want them sharp. You won't want anything else sharp. So if you're doing a sport event, what aperture are you probably using? Your widest. Does that make sense? To get less depth of field. What's your widest aperture going to give you? It's going to give you a faster shutter speed because the aperture is bigger. Does that make sense? So I tell most people to use aperture preferred when you're trying to do this. So if you haven't used it, try aperture preferred. Now I'm going to give something that I didn't know if I have time to give, but I do have got time to give it. And you're going to probably need to look this up. On your cameras, you have something called exposure compensation. Okay, on your cameras, and get this down because this is a biggie. On your camera, you have something called exposure compensation. Exposure compensation, when you change that, you're letting in, it goes by thirds of a stop. And I'm going to show you a bunch of examples where I'm using exposure compensation. Oh, that does make sense because my slides are coming up in just a minute. Okay? So when I use exposure, so I am on aperture preferred. So far, so good, right, everybody? Now, I got that white cat sitting in the snow. That white cat in the snow are 2 stops lighter than a gray card. So far, so good? There's 2 stops lighter than a gray card. And my camera thinks the snow is a gray card. So I want to open up 2 stops. So my exposure compensation, I go to +2. It sounds backwards, okay? Because snow, it's snow. You don't want the snow washed out. But your camera's making the snow middle gray. I'm going +2 to make the snow white like it's supposed to look. I'm going to show you examples in a minute. Does that make sense, everybody? That's what exposure compensation does. You can go +2, -2, +1, and there you would use thirds of a stop. You might go +1 1/3, 1 2/3, or something like that. So so everybody, let's say that you're shooting an animal out in the snow, but it's early in the day and it's not real light out, okay? And let's say the animal's out in the snow, and you go, and you're wide open, your biggest aperture, and you go +2, so the snow comes back out to being white. But because it's so dark out, your shutter speed's only like 1/8 of a second. What must you do now? Raise your what? Raise your what? You got the f-stop and shutter speed set, but the shutter speed's too slow. You want a faster shutter speed, so you change your, starts with I. The second letter is S. I won't tell you the third one. So but what you would do is you change your ISO. Does that make sense? And you would change your ISO until what? Until it gave you a shutter speed that was fast enough to hand hold. Does that make sense? So everybody, this is a lot for a 1-hour lecture, and I realize this. It's a whole lot for a 1-hour lecture. But so I'm going to suggest for all of you to probably try aperture preferred, and if you haven't been doing that, it's going to take a little getting used to, and then change your ISO, and then use exposure Okay, everybody, why do we not use exposure compensation? Most of the time we don't need it. If you're a landscape photographer, you're not shooting in wintertime, you got blue sky, you got green grass and green trees and blue water, that's all about 18%. That's why in landscape photography, your exposure is usually correct. You don't even need to think about exposure compensation because it's pretty good. You got an elk up on the hillside, and you got green or brown all around the elk, and it's close to 18% reflectance, okay? So normally your shots look good. You don't even think about exposure compensation. It's when the majority of your shot is really black or dark or really white, that's when you need exposure compensation. And what you do is you click a shot. Remember, it's not like film, it's free. Plus, you get to see it instantly, okay? And you click it and say, oh, it's a little too dark. I'll change my exposure compensation. Let's look at a few photographs, and I think this will make sense. And Sarah's being really nice to me and letting me go past time. And if any of you had to get out of here, you go ahead and get out of here if you want to. Let me go to Lightroom here, and I'll show you a few photographs. I picked about 20 photographs here to give you examples if I had time. So here's the one that was on the thing that came out from the library, okay? I was up photographing one-room schoolhouses up in eastern Montana. Who here from eastern Montana? Any eastern Montana? Yay! Where are you from? Oh. There's a little restaurant there called, I don't know, it's all black and white, a car place where they have all the, I eat there every time because I'm vegetarian. They have the only place in the Highland that has veggie burgers. So I know Havre quite well, so whatever that place is called. So everybody, here, I had, these clouds were moving so fast. Keith and I just shot a one-room school with all the kids that were there all day. And we were traveling in the afternoon, and all of a sudden, these weird clouds, they're probably like 200 feet above us, they were moving so fast. And we saw them a ways away. And here, I figured my exposure was probably pretty good here. My ISO was on my lowest ISO, which in my camera I was using was 200. My little Olympus is 200. I was on 200 ISO here. And I had equal amounts of dark gray and light gray. And so I didn't have to worry about it. And I didn't need much depth of field. Why? Because everything was at least, well, the power lines were kind of close. But I was on wide angle, and I just shot at my lowest ISO. It was easy. Make sense? Okay? Okay, let's just quickly, oh, wait a minute. Something's wrong here. So, let's go here. I'm shooting down this row of trees in the Tri-Cities area in Washington? Yeah, in the Tri-Cities area. So anyway, look what I'm shooting here. I've got pretty much, first of all, it's a pretty bright day. You with me so far? So my ISO is what? My base ISO. Make sense? Okay. And these are trees I think they use for telephone poles or something. I don't know, but there are all these tall trees there. And my exposure is pretty much 18%. I've got a little darker and a little lighter, pretty much 18%. So I don't need exposure compensation. But what do I need here? I need a lot of what? Depth of field. I need a lot of depth of field, so I'm probably at f16 here to make sure the trees in front are sharp and the trees all the way in the back are sharp. Making sense? Okay. Let's see if this thing is working right. Yes, it is. Okay, this is up in Waterton Lakes National Park, right above Glacier. And I saw this beautiful waterfall in the fall time. And what do I want here, everybody? What kind of shutter speed do I want? I want a slow shutter speed to blur the water, and I had a tripod. I think I'm at 1/4 of a second here. So do I need much depth of field? I can use a little bit, but everything's pretty much the same distance, so I'm probably like a 5.6, a little bit more than wide open to give me enough depth of field. But I'm probably at 5.6, and my shutter speed is going to be, my ISO is my base ISO, because I'm doing landscape. I want the high quality. So I'm at my base ISO, shooting the very slow shutter speed to blur the water. And this is how you do running water like that. If you don't have a tripod, you can try holding the camera steady, but probably really brace yourself and don't go below a 1/15 of a second. Okay? This is the Alabama Hills in California. And here in Alabama Hills, how much depth of field do I need? Everything is pretty much far away. Do we agree, everybody? I think I went here to 5.6 to get the highest quality I could get because I didn't need the depth of field. My ISO is as low as it goes because I want the quality. And then my shutter speed is just a fast enough shutter speed to hold the camera. And raise your hand or stop me on any of these if you want to. Make sense? Okay? Let's keep going. Okay, this is the falls at Glacier National Park. Lots of you recognize it. If you start walking up Trail of the Cedars, I mean not Trail, Avalanche Lake Trail, this is on your left, 300 feet above Trail of the Cedars. And so let's look at this one for a minute. Okay, I got a couple things going on here. First of all, it's not real bright. Okay, it's not super bright out. I want depth of field, you know, from here on. I want a fair amount of depth of field here. Do we agree? Okay, and I want a slow shutter speed. Okay, so I want a slow shutter speed on this, and I want my depth of field. And I probably am pretty close to 18% gray because the dark on the sides are a little darker than 18%, and obviously the water is lighter than 18%. And so I probably have a pretty good exposure here without using exposure compensation. Okay, we haven't gone to exposure compensation yet. What's the main thing I want here? Well, I want two things. I want what kind of shutter speed? Slow. And I want what kind of depth of field? A lot. Well, everybody want to go to a slow shutter speed. Then, because the shutter speed is letting in so much light, I'm going to have to go to small aperture. And so this worked perfect. This is probably like, I think it's 1/4 of a second, I believe, at f16. Okay? Ask me questions if you got them. It's like, it's only like, okay. Anyone see the Nutcracker this year? No one made it? Everybody, you all go to Nutcracker. It's such a good event. Okay, this is this year's Nutcracker. Okay, and my ISO, they're on stage. How bright is stage lighting? Now think about this. I need a shutter speed fast enough to be able to stop action of people moving. And he's always moving fast. Okay, he's in every Nutcracker I've shot, and he's always moving fast. My ISO here is 3200. That's high, which means I have more noise in this photograph. I don't think you see a whole lot of it here, but if I made a print, you'd see a little bit more noise on it. And like I said, I'm shooting at 3200 ISO. I would never go 3200 if I didn't need to, because I can get more noise. Okay? So I'm at 3200 ISO. Now, how much depth of field do I need? Well, everybody, there's no one in the audience except, this is dress rehearsal, the day before the Nutcracker started. I'm back in the audience, and there's no one in front of me. I'm about 4 rows back in the Montana Theater at UM. And They're all pretty much the same distance. I think I'm here, I think I'm at f2.8 or 4. Okay, they're far enough away and I'm wide angle need less up the field. So I'm shooting here pretty much wide open. Because if I wasn't wide open, I want a fast enough shutter speed to stop the action. If I wasn't wide open, what would I need to do with my ISO? If I wasn't wide open, my aperture is a stop or two smaller, I'd be getting less light, and my ISO would have to go from 3200 to what? 6400. Does that make sense? I would start seeing noise in that, okay, because it's going higher. Okay, and if I made a print of this, you'd see noise. My sensors, anyway, you'd see some noise on it. Whoops, don't go away. Come back. Come back, okay. Whoops, don't come back there, come back here. Okay, let's go back here. Okay, now let's go. Okay, now what's happening? Okay, this is the fight scene in the Nutcracker, and that big mouse with a sword is jumping. What do I need here, everybody? What am I thinking about here? By the way, on both of these shots, well, especially the last one, everything was average, it was 18%. This is close to 18%. Okay, there's a little bit more dark in the shot, so I might be using a little exposure compensation. But what am I concerned here with? Shutter speed. Why? Because there's a lot of movement in this. And even here, little bit of blur down here, and that's because my shutter speed, I didn't want to go to 6400. If I wanted to go to a faster shutter speed, then I could have stopped them, but I have more noise. Okay. I love backstage at a ballet. I think backstage is so much fun. And these are two of the, you can see one of the guy on the right is one of these guys here waiting to go on stage and so forth. So everybody, what am I doing here? How dark is the background? It's black. So if I did not use exposure, and I'm 3200, if I did not use exposure compensation, their faces would be pure white. Because the camera sees all that dark and it says, I need to make everything middle gray. And it would make this, because there's more of the black here, it would make that middle gray and their faces would be light. So I'm on minus exposure compensation here. Because the camera wants to make everything lighter because it's trying to make it middle gray. So I go minus to make it darker. I will get to birds in a minute. I'll be past the ballet, but the stage stuff is probably good for you to see. Okay, it's intermission. Okay, and I love intermission. I love being backstage and the dancers and so forth. And everybody, this is pretty much 18%. It's close. The floor is dark. Their dresses are white. I mean, it's all pretty much 18%. So, but I'm still at 3,200. Okay, easy. And okay, this we did. Our last photography workshop our school ever did was in Cuba 2 years ago, because now we don't go off and do workshops anymore. This is a Cuba dancer in Havana. And so what am I doing here? Okay, I've got lots of light coming in the windows and so forth. So what I'm doing is I am using my exposure. I'm focused on her, and I want some depth of field because I like the dancers back here being almost sharp, not quite sharp. So I'm trying to get some, and I love the architecture in this old Cuba building. And so I'm shooting almost wide open. My ISO is probably about 400 or 800 here, I can't remember. Because it's darker in here, but not nearly as dark as on stage. So again, what do I want? The lowest ISO I can get without, I want the lowest ISO I can get. And there's not much action here. Okay. Okay, this is the one now, Run Wild Missoula. I used to shoot all the races for Run Wild Missoula. And so everybody look at the shot, okay? It's the daytime, it's the marathon and half marathon. Who here has ever run the Missoula Marathon or half marathon? Let's see your hands. Congratulations. You're the only one in here, I guess. Okay, good. And everybody, I love being at the finish line. I think it's so much fun. And I want a shallow depth of field so the people in the background are out of focus, right? I got a fast shutter speed, probably 500th a second to stop the action. But what's the other problem I've got? That white sky is so white that it would make her partly silhouetted. Does that make sense? So I'm on +1 here. The shot would have been one stop too dark. So I practiced this before someone came in that I want to take a picture of, looked at my camera and said, oh, I need +1 exposure compensation so she doesn't come out as partly a silhouette. Let's do a few more. Okay, same thing here. That white sky is the camera would like to make this picture darker, so I'm using probably +1 here again. And this guy looks pretty excited about finishing, I think. And again, behind him, it's all white. This is where your shots come out too dark. So I'm using exposure compensation to lighten my shots. And I got to hurry up because the library closes in 20 minutes. And see, Sarah, you didn't even have to tell me. Okay, everybody, let's go to bird photography. Council Grove and Lee Metcalf, if you like birds, this is Council Grove. What's my exposure compensation? 0, because everything's 18% average. Make sense, everybody? Easy, okay? Okay, this bald eagle just found something to eat. Look at that white sky. If I didn't know exposure compensation, that bald eagle would be black, okay? It would be underexposed. I'm probably +3 here to make him come out right. And he was sitting there forever. I stood there for 20 minutes. He's up in a tree, actually, in our front yard. We live on Butler Creek Road, and that big tree is standing up there. And I went and got my camera, and he just stayed and posed for me. It was great. But I'm on plus here. I'm probably my lowest ISO. What's my aperture at? Wide open, because what depth of field do I want? Shallow as I can go. Okay. Pileated woodpecker, Lee Metcalf, Council Grove State Park, right down Mullen Road. They'll be there this year also. And I'm probably on +1 because the white on the left-hand side is enough light to make my shot underexposed. So I went +1 so the pileated woodpeckers would look good. And I'm going quick because of time. Okay, this is the hummingbird. It might not be the same one, but they're always in the same branch at Council Grove. If you like birds, go to Council Grove State Park because you'll see them. But that sky was bright. What would your camera do here? Give you a black hummingbird. Does that make sense? Okay, exposure compensation on +3 to make the bird. So the sky, which was blue, comes out white. But if the sky came out right, the hummingbird would be pure black. This is starting to make more sense, isn't it? Okay. Garrett, where are these owls? Council Grove State Park. Who's been to Council Grove? You know where that big tree with the hole is? You've seen them there then, haven't you? And they're every year. So in about 3 weeks, go to Council Grove State Park and look at the hole right by the parking lot and the giant dead tree there. And you'll see the owls there, and they're kind of watching me, and I'm on probably +1 1/3 or +1 2/3. Okay, birds flying. New cameras can stop birds from flying. Okay, and they focus on the eyes even now. Cameras are getting smarter. Okay, I'm probably on +1 here. We're almost done. Okay, macro shot. Okay, I'm probably wide open because I wanted the pink in the background to be all soft and so forth. So I'm probably wide open. Did I need exposure compensation? No, because everything's 18%. Okay, and my f-stop is wide open. My shutter speed's fast enough where I can hold the camera steady. If it was too dark out and the shutter speed wasn't fast enough, I would raise my ISO. You guys are getting it. Isn't this kind of fun when it makes sense? Okay, I want a shallow depth of field just to get one set of the flowers sharp across there. I think this is up at wherever the pass is in Idaho. Okay, everything's average. No exposure compensation needed. Okay, grasshopper in our yard, no exposure compensation, wide open to get a shallow depth of field because I want whatever those flowers are, whatever, you know what they are, out of focus in the background. Okay, okay, this landed right in front of me, but the dragonfly was in the sun, but the background was in the shade, which is cool because the background went almost pure black. So what did I have to do here exposure compensation-wise? I went to minus, because all that black would have come out too much, so I went to probably -1 here. And I'm almost done. Okay, Glacier National Park, last beginning of June on a hike, probably pretty much average. I got dark along the edges, green is middle 18%, and the flowers are lighter. Okay, I'm probably shooting at my lowest ISO because I got enough light, nothing's moving, I can hold the camera steady. Okay, a couple one-room schoolhouse photos will quit. This is from the book that Keith and I did. This is the teacher, and there's 3 kids in this one-room school, all brothers and sisters. And probably stop down a little bit to get the teacher and the kids sharp and get the schoolhouse sharp. So I'm probably stopped down just a little bit here. Okay, this is at Yak School, one-room school up in the northwest corner. And look at those windows letting in so much light coming in there. So what do I have to do here? I had to go to plus so that the kid would not be silhouetted. And there's only a couple slides. Same with this little girl. She was in front of one-room school. The sky, this is plus to make her sharp. And this is my, I got one more after this. This is a Hutterite school we went to. What kind of depth of field do I want here? Shallow. Because good, I want her sharp, but I want the 4 boys in the back. And what's my exposure compensation here on probably? Plus. Oh, you guys are getting good. Okay. And I'll finish with the Garden of 1,000 Buddhas. Okay. What's my exposure compensation? +2 probably, right? Because the camera would have made the middle gray and now they're white. And what's my f-stop probably? Look at my depth of field. It's probably what? My aperture is what? Wide open, because I want a shallow depth of field. And that, everybody, is a few basics on exposure. Hopefully you picked up something tonight that makes your photography fun. Be fun to see you again some other time. We're going to keep doing free lectures here. So next, Rob's one, yours the next one? Next one, yeah, landscape. Landscape is next. Third Wednesday of April. Third Wednesday, oh, thank you, Sarah. So everybody, thank you. Have a good day, and yeah. Okay. Bye. And I'll stick around for a couple minutes.